This is Dorothy Charlo, and today's date is August 2nd, 2012, and I'm interviewing Bill Cohen with regard to his involvement with the Rocky Flats Lamm-Wirth Task Force of some years ago. And this is for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program. Thank you very much, Bill. And the first question I'll ask is, when and where were you born?
I was born in New York City on August the 8th, 1940. So I got a birthday coming up next week.
Yes, yes. And can you tell me just a little bit of information about yourself, kind of leading up to how you got involved with this?
Well, let's start with law school. I went to law school at Georgetown, University of Law School. I actually have an LLB and an LLM degree from Georgetown. I clerked on a federal district court and federal court of appeals, and then I was an assistant United States attorney for the District of Columbia for 3.5 years, which is both the local DC prosecutor and the federal prosecutor in the District of Columbia. And then I came out to Boulder, Colorado in June of 1969 to teach at the CU Law School and to run the clinical legal education program there. I was the first full-time faculty director of the CU clinic.
I see.
Legal Aid and Defender program is what it was called.
Okay, so it was a clinic to teach law students particular skills?
Yes, and they actually, Colorado had at that time the most liberal student practice law in the country, and so I had 100 law students who were practicing law under my supervision, and I also hired a staff attorney, and then in the second year we added another faculty member and another staff attorney. So for a while we were the largest law firm in Colorado. We represented poor people, indigents in civil and criminal cases, misdemeanors. And the students were the lawyers. So it was exciting, interesting, challenging.
Yes.
And I also taught several classes during that period. I was leading up to how I got on the Rocky Flats Task Force. I was active in Democratic politics in Boulder from the time we got here in '69, and when we went into private practice, I took a leave of absence from the law school in September of '73, and my wife had been practicing law out of her house after our first child was born, my daughter Madeline. She invited me to join her practice because it was growing, and we formed a private law firm of Cohen and Cohen. And we had our first office in it's now the Broadway building, the old Woolworth building at Broadway and Pearl.
Yeah. And you made that change for what reasons?
I got tired of what I was doing and decided I wanted to change, and went into private practice for the first time. And Sarah Jane and I actually shared a desk, and we shared babysitting or home caring for our children. My son was actually born a year later, and it just so happened that one of the young lawyers who was working one floor below us was David Skaggs. And David came up one day, we became friends, and asked us if we would meet with a young man who was going to run for Congress in this district, whose name was Tim Wirth.
So
and we said we'd be glad to meet him, and he came into our office one day, and we sat and chatted, and we decided we liked him, and we would support him, and ultimately Sarah Jane and I became the media representatives for his congressional campaign to tell you how things have changed.
Yes,
We were
interesting.
going around delivering press releases all over the county of Boulder.
And as I recall, he was it was kind of amazing that he got elected.
This was the election was in November of 1974, which was right after Watergate. So he was what was known then as a Watergate baby. And so Dick Lamm also got elected to the governorship. And I think Gary Hart got elected to the Senate the same year. Tim was one of these guys that wasn't going to let any grass grow under his feet. Within a week or two of his being elected, before he was ever sworn in, he went to Washington to organize the freshman class, which was a large group of newly elected Democrats because they were Watergate babies. And he did that, and he organized them such that they challenged some of the old established Democratic chairs and got some of them set aside and some new people elected. And it was on an airplane ride coming back from one of those trips that he happened to sit next to Governor-elect Dick Lamm. And they got to talking, and they finally came around to talking about Rocky Flats, because they had been asked by respective constituents to do something about it. I was one of the people that whispered in Tim's ear after he got elected, might well have been on election night, that he needs to do something about Rocky Flats because people have been contacting me about it.
Yeah.
So they decided on that plane ride, as I understand it, to create a task force of citizens to look into the plant and find out what the problems were and make recommendations to them as to what should be done.
And they kind of had the power to do that because one was governor and one was a congressman.
At the time, they were governor-elect and congressman-elect.
Yeah.
Had not yet been sworn into
That's
office.
right.
And the task force was created and formed before they were ever sworn in. It didn't actually begin its work until afterwards. And Tim asked me to be on the task force as his representative. Although I'm listed in the report as attorney at law, and I was the only attorney on the task force, and there were some legal issues that I dealt with, I was primarily his representative. Governor-elect Lamm had his chief of staff, Jim Monahan, as his representative to the task force. So the two politicians had their inside person, so to speak, who was answerable to them on the task force. They didn't actually participate in the task force's work until the very end, and then of course they did the follow-up of the things that we requested that they do.
Yeah. Do you know how they each, or collective, the both of them, selected the other people?
Well, if you just run down the list, you see that they were pretty much selected for expertise relevant to the kinds of issues we anticipated were involved in Rocky Flats, and also political interest and political clout, local political county level. I'm going to step back a minute. I thought it slipped my mind. In any event, so the chair of the task force was Bob Seek, who was, I believe, the head of the Colorado Department of Health. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. After it had been announced, I believe, my memory is not totally clear to the timing, but it was certainly before the task force got going, some citizen in Boulder gave me a thick packet of articles that they had been collecting over the years. This was, in the fall of 1974, so these go back probably to the 50s, late 50s and 60s, about all the things that had been reported in the press about problems at Rocky Flats.
Oh, that's interesting, because we know there was a lot of things that weren't reported. So,
Right, but the major things, the burial of the plutonium laced oil in barrels that was leaking, was discovered by a scientist who was monitoring the accidents that had occurred. I believe even the radioactive leak into the Great Western Reservoir was reported. And what was also reported was many efforts to get the then Republican congressman to do something about it, which they refused to do. And it's important to put this in context. This was started in the late 50s, or mid-50s, I think 1954, which was both the Cold War, just post-Korean War, McCarthy era atmosphere. And people weren't about to challenge and raise issues about nuclear armament at that time. The times in 1974, post-Watergate, were different. And so were the elected politicians. So to get back to who was on it, there was a representative, I believe a scientist, Wesley Britton from the University of Colorado, Pat Burrows, who was a state representative, I think, from Jefferson County, myself, John Cobb, who was an epidemiologist at the University of Colorado School of Medicine, very interested in what the impact of exposure to radiation was on the body after people had died. Pat Kelly, who represented the United Steelworkers of America, who were the people working there. George Lucas, who was the Colorado School of Mines, who had some expertise, because what was really happening at Rocky Flats is they were machining plutonium rocks into triggers for nuclear weapons. So it was basically an elements mine type use of mined material. Uranium converted into plutonium, then shaped in a certain way that it would operate as a trigger for a nuclear weapon. Maggie Markey, who was a Boulder County Commissioner, Jim Monahan, Governor Lamb's representative, Joanne Patterson, who was a Jefferson County Commissioner, Art Robinson, who was at National Jewish Hospital, was a cancer doctor and expert. And then there was Robert Damrauer, who was acting as our technical assistant and reporter, keeping track of things. Those are the people who are on the task force. Can we take a break?
Sure. We're resuming the interview with Bill Cohen. So we were talking about the people on the task force.
Right.
Can you remember where you met and what your first, how it was when you first?
No, we met fairly frequently. We toured the Rocky Flats plant. One of the first things that, I'm sorry. You may have to do this.
Yeah.
I got it, I think.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yes. So you toured the plant.
Toured the plant, but one of the most important meetings that happened before the task force actually started working together. And this was sometime before Congressman-elect Wirth was sworn in. He invited a representative of ERDA. ERDA was the Energy Research and Development Administration that had taken over from the Atomic Energy Commission.
Yeah.
It was the government agency that owned the Rocky Flats plant and that leased it by contract to first Dow Chemical, and now they were just about to be taken over by Rockwell International. And he invited this high-level official to come to his house for a kind of informal meeting, get to know each other, and he asked me to be there. And I was there. And it was a very nice, cordial conversation, and at some point, I can't remember how it came up, this gentleman mentioned that there had been a siting study done as to where to site this plant, this nuclear weapons manufacturing plant. And they had several places around the country. They narrowed it down. They narrowed it down to Denver. And we said, we would like a copy of that.
Oh.
And he said, I'm paraphrasing, well, it's classified, but I think I can get you one. And one of my first jobs was to kind of keep the pressure up to get it, and we got it. And I think that was one of the pivotal moments in the whole process, because what we found was they had used criteria which was false. The biggest point being, they said the plant was leeward, meaning sheltered from the major population area, which it was not.
Right.
Denver was to the west. And they said the prevailing winds at Rocky Flats, the area they had designated, were from the south. And we all know that they're from the west,
Yes.
which meant that any plutonium that escaped would get blown towards Denver. And of course we know today the population has grown up tremendously all around the area, north, south, and west. And that was very revealing.
Oh, yeah.
And part of the problem was, of course, there was no public input or knowledge of the criteria, the study that they had done, or the results that they had done. It was kept as a secret, because it was a nuclear weapons plant in the 1950s. That was a critical fact that was prominent in our report ultimately, and in our thinking about what should be done about this plant. And it happened kind of like a fluke in a way.
Yeah, yeah.
Then once the task force formed, I think we may have met at the Department of Health a few times, because Bob Seek was the chair. As I said, we did, and we educated ourselves as much as we could before we toured the plant. And we had a pretty good tour of the plant. So we could eyeball what these people did working at the plant. And that was very important in my thinking of what had to be done to run that plant safely if you could, and some of the problems.
And you all were probably the first non-government, non-Rocky Flats people to tour the plant.
I have a feeling that that's true, because of all the secrecy and the security and everything. And we learned some very interesting things. We learned what they did there. That first of all, this is a nuclear plant, but it's not a nuclear energy plant like Three Mile Island or Hanford or the ones in Japan that just blew up and went critical.
Yeah.
This was basically a machine shop operation, and they had trained people who worked on mills just like they'd work in some factory making gears, using lathes, except that the material they were working with was laced with plutonium, which we learned is probably the most deadly substance in the world. It's highly toxic, radioactive. It has a half-life of 24,000 years. So after 24,000 years, only half of it is dissipated. When it's broken down into other, some of which I think are also radioactive, but they're not plutonium. But half the plutonium is still there. And tiny, I mean microscopic amounts, if you ingested it, if it got into your lungs, could cause you to have cancer over a period of time. And no one really knew just how long it would take and how much it would take. These were some of the problems involved. The other problem is these guys were working in glove boxes because they couldn't actually, like you would work on a piece of metal in a lathe, just have safety glasses, but your hands would be out and free. They had to work through glove box, and they had to be air sealed, and they had to have exhaust material to take the stuff, little particles that are taken off and as they're shaping the trigger. And two things about that. First of all, we learned that these exhaust facilities were contaminated with plutonium, and these were just rubber gloves that they worked in, these glove boxes, and accidents happen. You slip with a lathe, it's a sharp knife, it'll open up a hole in the glove and contaminate the operator, or it can cut the person, and plutonium could get inside a cut, and they had to be taken care of right away. And the record keeping was sloppy. Their facilities were, we didn't think, adequate medically to take care of people in these things. Now, the one thing we learned was there was no what you would call criticality experiments, except for one tiny experimental thing where they approached criticality but never reached it, and it was not anything like the level of a nuclear energy plant. So there wasn't going to be a big explosion, even though there was an accident. There were fires, and most of the fires didn't breach the walls of the facility. I think there may have been one or two where plutonium was released.
Of course, they had had the big fire in 1969, which was before you
Right.
were meeting. Yeah.
That was a major one. The other thing they had done, which was public, but we learned some facts about it, is the waste plutonium was in machine oil, was stored in barrels. And I guess they didn't have a way of disposing of it off-site in some nuclear burial facility, which hadn't become available. So they started back in the 50s, burying these barrels on site. And this went on until the late 60s. And at some point, the people at the plant discovered that the barrels were leaking, and plutonium was drifting outside the area where they had been buried in. So they covered the area. I don't know if they put concrete down or what. I don't think they did. They just covered the drift area. But then somebody put defoliant out there and exposed these areas. And they knew about it. They knew about it for years, and they just kept it quiet. So that was a big problem of the lack of public knowledge of what was happening, what accidents were occurring, what risks were occurring. And then the third big thing we discovered was there had been a shipment to Rocky Flats of some material to be disposed of. And Rocky Flats had these storage tanks where stuff that was contaminated would be stored for a long period of time, and would, I guess the heavy metals that were in it, the radioactivity would settle down, and the water would then be released into the Great Western Reservoir, which was the source of water for Broomfield. Turns out, unbeknownst to people at Rocky Flats at the time, some of this waste stuff that came through had tritium in it, which is also a very highly toxic radioactive material. And that tritium, as well as plutonium, had gotten into the Great Western Reservoir. Now it was sitting on the bottom. Supposedly the health department was monitoring it, and they said it was below the then toxic level that it was safe for man. But we learned historically, every time they periodically review what is a safe level of radiation for human beings, they lowered the threshold. And we learned that any amount of exposure to radiation is not good because it's cumulative. And we already have higher than normal radiation in the background in Colorado. All of us are exposed to radiation that's in the ground. That's why we have uranium mines in some areas. So these are all troubling facts that we had to come to grips with at some point. And it was part of our learning curve to find out as much as we could about how this plant operated, what its problems were, and then we came out with a preliminary report of our early findings, the purpose of which was to give a little education to the public, and we held 2 days of public hearings.
And this was some months after you had
Yeah,
the
not
meeting?
that long after. I have the dates. Hold on a second. Yeah, the task force was appointed in December '74. Our preliminary report came out in February '75, just 2 months later.
Oh, wow. So
And we
you all
had-
worked fast.
We had hearings in Denver and in Broomfield on April 14th and 15th, '75.
Going back a little way, could I ask you, can you recall, what was the feeling tone of the meetings? I mean, did you feel that you all were working
We
together?
were very collegial. That doesn't mean there wasn't some differences of opinion. Jack Cobb was very forceful in pushing the need for independent epidemiological studies of people who had died who had been exposed to radiation, and to look at their bodies, their organs, and see if they were affected in some way, if there was pre-cancer or cancer coming. He wasn't satisfied with what had been done previously, not by us, of course. We weren't doing anything, but learning. But he was very forceful in pushing his points. The union representative, Mr. Kelly, was very concerned about the potential loss of jobs should we recommend that they shut the plant down.
Yeah.
But he was also very critical of the plant's safety record and the exposure his workers were getting and the treatment they were getting. So there was that tension, but it was amicable. In other words, we were open and respectful of each other, and we worked very well collegially, cooperated very well. So I guess that answers the question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then you had the first public meeting.
We had first public hearings, and they were somewhat helpful. They were somewhat amusing. We had a farmer come in and display to us, I think, pictures of a two-headed calf, and claim this was caused by drinking the water from Great Western Reservoir. Well, we had no way of evaluating if that was actually true or not. But we had a lot of people from the area who were living in the vicinity of the plant come and tell us their concerns. And
Was it well attended, and was it?
generally it was, not overwhelming. And then, let's see, we issued the report in October '75,
The full report.
full report. So we started at some point drafting, and we did break up the assignments. Mr. Domrauer did the introduction. I did some editing on that, and I took the responsibility of drafting the first draft of all the recommendations, which I'm pleased to say were largely adopted. There was some editing, but in terms of substance, I think almost everyone was accepted by the committee. I had taken a lot of notes. Being a lawyer, I was used to taking the lead on drafting things like that. And then other...
So did those recommendations just kind of flow from what?
They did. It
what
flowed
you
from
learned?
what we had learned, and some recommendations had been asked of us by various people. But they really came out of the history that we learned and our eyeballing the operations and our feelings about what the risks were. There were two things that impressed me viewing the operation. One is if you work next to a coal-burning furnace, let's say in a steel plant, you're being bombarded by several hundred-degree heat all the time. You're constantly aware of the risk and the danger. Even so, accidents happen. If you're working on a plutonium piece, maybe the thing is as big as a hockey puck when you start out. It's colorless, odorless, doesn't make any noise, there's no warning while you're working on it. And I think you become, as a human being, complacent. After a while, you think you're working on just another piece of metal. Even though people wear badges, if they're exposed to radiation and they're supposed to be checked, it's questionable how accurate those are. but nevertheless, that's after the fact. I mean, you may not discover that until you're on your way home, when you may have been exposed hours earlier.
Yeah.
And the quicker that you got treated and decontaminated, the better you are in terms of risk for radiation damages. So that meant, to me, you had to have safety devices that were unusual and may not have even been technologically developed yet. That was one of our recommendations. The second thing was, accidents happen. And I asked several times a sort of rhetorical question of them is, what is the next accident that's going to happen that you can't anticipate? Which, of course, they can't answer. But that was the point. It's one thing to be in a machine shop and maybe somebody cuts a finger off. It's another thing to be in a nuclear weapons plant where plutonium gets into the water supply for a whole city and puts a lot of people at risk. Or a bomb the place is attacked by an airplane, for example. Yeah. And there's a big explosion and the stuff gets out into the atmosphere and little tiny particles get in the air and who knows where they get blown. So that required some thinking about it in terms of should this plant be where it is, or should it be, as we recommended, if you're going to continue this operation, someplace far, far from population centers and extra special safety precautions and medical facilities and warnings and things like that. So that's how what we learned translated into recommendations.
And the recommendations, I just glanced at it, but can you kind of give a little bit of a...
Yeah. There were, I think, 16 or 17 separate recommendations, and several of those had subparts to them, so it was really maybe 30 or so. And at one point, this is not something I did now, I did this back at the time we issued the report. I kind of broke the report to give it some perspective into 5 goals or 5 major themes. Because one of the things I did after we issued the report was I was one of the people who briefed various segments of the public, excuse me, and the media. So I broke it down to 5 major areas. One was there needed to be independence of review, oversight, and research done. Couldn't rely.
Independence from the management of the plant and the government?
The government agency that was managing them.
Sure.
Because what we found and we said in this report, that Dow, when they were supposed to be supervising, not Dow, the Department of Energy and ERDA, when they were supposed to be supervising Dow, had been very lax. So you couldn't rely on them. Now ERDA had been there a while, and they had a new operator in Rockwell who was coming in under different circumstances, obviously. There was going to be more scrutiny of them. But we felt there had to be independent review, and many of our recommendations fell into that category. Secondly, there needed to be public disclosure and education of what goes on there in terms of accidents, operations, and the public needed to know about what was going on, both what the nature of the facility was and anything bad that occurred, such as an accident or a fire or some other exposure.
And just a quick question here. I think at this point there was no really citizen oversight.
No, this is the first
this was the,
of all of them, which is sort of the seminal group that opened up scrutiny of the plant and what went on.
Right.
Third, we felt that the federal government had responsibility, particularly for funding any of the costs involved in achieving these goals, and for correcting the problems like providing Broomfield with a new water supply,
Uh-huh.
which they ultimately did
Oh,
at our recommendation. And paying any costs that the state or the local governments incurred in doing the monitoring and anything like that. For example, one of the things we recommended is that there be nearby trained hospital facilities who could take on radiation
oh,
exposed patients. Well, that costs money, and it's got to be standby because it's not happening every day. But if it happens once, and you have 10 or 15 or 100 people exposed, who's going to handle them?
uh-huh.
So we felt all of this, plus continued monitoring, which we recommended, had to be at the federal expense. The fourth area was that there needed to be cooperation between the federal government, state government, and other federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, which had not been involved in the monitoring, in the safety issues, in the questions of how to handle the plant as long as it was going to be there.
Uh-huh. Now, the Environmental Protection Agency was just beginning at that time, wasn't it?
Probably it was in
Yeah.
early ages,
Yeah.
early days of its
Yeah.
environment. I don't know exactly when. Actually,
Might have
take
been
that back.
later.
I think it was created by Nixon.
Oh, okay.
It would have
realize
been
that.
in the 60s. Yeah. So it was 10 years old at least.
Uh-huh.
But it had no role
Yeah.
prior to this. And then last, we were very concerned about the public and industrial health and safety. In other words, what was the risk of radiation exposure or other dangers to the public, the people who lived around the plant, and the people who worked in the plant. And all of our recommendations fit pretty much into one or more of those 5 categories.
And those recommendations were accepted by the whole group.
Yes.
So
Yes,
it was a
we were
consensus.
unanimous in the report. There's no dissent. And Governor Lamm and Congressman Wirth said publicly, and actually Governor Lamm wrote a letter to the director of Rockwell saying, we stand by those recommendations and we will do everything possible to implement them. And one of the things that I was concerned about, having watched government for many years, although I was still a young man, I'd been involved in government, is a lot of studies get done and they sit on the shelf. And I was convinced that Tim Wirth and Dick Lamm were not going to let it sit on the shelf. And in fact, Tim, who had an advanced copy of this, started writing letters to the various federal agencies pursuant to our recommendations, even before or right after the report was made public. To get the EPA involved, we called for a Government Accounting Office investigation as to how these mistakes were allowed to happen without federal supervision coming to bear by what was it? Was a nuclear agency.
The Nuclear Regulatory,
Maybe. The not Department of Energy.
there was the
Anyway.
NRC, Nuclear Regulatory
Commission?
Commission, yeah.
So I'll look, it's recommendation, the last recommendation. Oh, the Atomic Energy Commission,
Oh, of course, yes.
AEC.
AEC, yeah.
Yeah. And it didn't. As we know, there is no longer a Rocky Flats plant.
Yeah.
It took
Yeah.
a lot of years.
Yeah.
But they began right away. Our number one recommendation was that they create a permanent monitoring committee.
Uh-huh.
And that was established.
Mhm.
And it lasted, I think, about 3 years. And then as things moved on, there was even legislation that provided, federal legislation that provided for various kinds of monitoring committees that evolved over the years as things progressed.
Uh-huh.
decision.
Was that kind of folded into the Citizens Advisory Board?
That was one of
arose?
the, that was one of the monitoring groups.
Uh-huh.
And then there were several others. And I actually
Yeah.
printed out today a timeline of some of these things. The task force, of course, began it, and then subsequently there was the Rocky Flats Environmental Monitoring Council
Uh-huh.
in '87, which was replaced in '93 by the Rocky Flats Citizens Advisory Board. And then subsequent to that, there was a future site using working group. There was an industrial area transition task force. Rocky Flats was really divided into two areas. One, the industrial area where the facilities were, and then the surrounding buffer zone.
Mm-hmm.
And they were treated differently, obviously.
Uh-huh.
It turned out that the industrial area was much more contaminated than they anticipated. All these buildings were full of plutonium and other radioactive materials. The estimates at the time we issued our report as to how much it would cost to clean it up was from $500 million to $1 billion. Ultimately, in July of 1995, the government signed a contract with Kaiser Hill to clean up the site with a target completion date of 2010. That's how long it was going to take. And the cost was estimated at $7.3 billion. So it was a much bigger job, and it took a lot longer than anybody thought, but people kept after it with
Yeah.
all these public scrutinies.
Yeah.
The last one, I believe, was the Rocky Flats Coalition of Local Governments, which was representatives of all the local governments, kept their finger on it as a monitoring group to make sure the job was done. It was cleaned up and it was converted to something useful, which is what we recommended.
Right. And those, the local governments, that existed for years, didn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they even still be going on for all I know.
Yeah. Thinking back to the 70s, I mean, the plant was still going full tilt in terms of production of the triggers.
Right.
Did you all envision that, you know, as you put forth these recommendations, that it might just close? I mean, or was
No.
it sort of beyond?
No,
I would imagine.
We anticipated that it would take a good while.
Uh-huh.
That this was not something that was going to be easy to do.
Right.
Required federal legislation,
Right.
authorization of at least $1 billion, which in that time was a fair amount of money. As it turned out, almost 20 years later, it was $7 billion plus. That they
So-
weren't going
so
to
you
shut it
had
down
made-
right away. There was a whole economic entity there. You had all these
Yeah.
employees, you had all of the spin-off economic activity in the surrounding area, all the purchasing that they did. And so that's why a lot of our recommendations were, number one, watch it carefully. Number two, increase the safety and the security. One of our recommendations is that they FAA ban any flying over the plant.
Uh-huh. That had not been the case before.
No. You know, increase the health department inspections without notice. You know, lots of those kinds of things. The medical stuff, increasing safety inside the plant, upgrade the facilities. They were about to open a brand new building because they knew the building they had been operating was so highly contaminated. Wasn't safe to work in anymore. And we anticipated it would take a good while.
Yeah.
And that's why we made so many recommendations. And we couched our recommendation of shutting it down in somewhat diplomatic language. Basically saying, if you're going to cite this type of facility today, it would never be put where it is. And that they should look into phasing it out and phasing in something benign. But there's one phrase I'd kind of like to read you that I think
Sure.
made
Yes.
it pretty clear where we're heading. Let's see if I can find it. Here. It's on page 6 of the report. The certainty that such a plant would not today be located at Rocky Flats, as well as our feeling that accidents will continue to occur even under the best circumstances, dictate our belief that such a plant should not be located at Rocky Flats. That was in the introduction to the report. So I thought that was pretty clear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty clear. That, and that was the direction it took off in. Let's make it as safe as possible, and let's start looking at correcting the problems, replace the water, stop the leaks, monitor it carefully, independently, and then look towards phasing it out.
I'm curious, was there much examination at that point on the task force of what had actually happened in the fires, in particular the 1969 fire?
Well, as much as we could get information about those things and what was done, we did.
Yeah.
And then we found out, how long they knew about the leaks in the pad, the so-called pad area where they had buried stuff.
Yeah.
They ultimately concreted it over.
Right, yeah.
Excuse me.
Sure. So it sounds like you used reports from the press, the written reports that they handed over to you, as well as all of you on the task force having visited the plant and observed what the operations
And we
were
asked
like.
lots of questions.
What
They
was
were
your-
pretty forthcoming.
They were?
Yeah. And we asked for, when we would learn about reports, we'd ask for them and we got them. So we had a lot of documentation. I think one of the satisfying things to me was that no one really questioned what we recommended. Tim Wirth went right to work on it. Governor went right to work on it. Accepted it. The public did. There's only one editorial criticism, which was we were going too slowly in terms of what we recommended. But as a practical matter, we felt that made sense. If we said shut it down tomorrow, it wouldn't have happened, and we might have been criticized for being unrealistic.
Right, yeah.
And we might have had union opposition as well, which we didn't want.
Right, yeah. Did you all meet with any of the protesters or the activists?
There weren't, well,
They probably were
activists
contacting you.
were contacting us. Some of the scientists, Dr. Martell, I believe he was still alive at that point, probably testified at our hearing. And there was one other, Professor Boyd, I think it was. So they had written reports and we had those. We had a lot of information and a lot of support for what we were recommending. And nobody challenged it. It just took a good while, which is why we recommended you got to keep your eye on this plant.
Yeah.
Externally, from people who aren't embedded in it.
Right, right.
In order to keep them.
Yeah. Which was really a
the feet
major
to the fire.
change, wasn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, because there
absolutely.
had been
The
no
nuclear weapons plant
Yeah. Right.
with people from the
Secret.
outside
Yeah.
looking in and making recommendations. The major job was done by the state health department. And we got them in, and then ultimately there was an agreement years later signed by DOE, Department of Energy, Colorado Department of Health, and the EPA was brought in, which was a big change to look at. And one of our recommendations was that there had to be environmental impact studies done when any changes or any major shifts would go on there. So we put a lot of burden on them that they didn't have before. To their credit, Rockwell said they had already started implementing things that they could implement without HERDA permission as soon as they got the report. They were being very proactive. They were playing good citizen.
Yeah. Do you think that, did you have the feeling that they were wanting to be cooperative because Dow had come in with had been criticized so harshly?
Yes, and I think they were concerned about liability.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure if they were, I didn't have anything to do with any of the litigation that was brought. Quite a bit of it was. And I don't know if they were sued or not. But that was their concern. And,
Yeah.
you know, there's a lot of politics and PR involved in all of this thing. It was pretty complicated, and to have what our product be accepted virtually intact without any real criticism and implemented as much as it did. I mean, the ultimate goal was achieved.
Yeah.
Took 30 years, but
Yeah.
but to actually be the cleanup, shutting down occurred a lot earlier than that.
Yeah. Yes.
So.
Now, you said that you put together the recommendations and other people took sections of it?
Yes,
and,
the scientific sections were done by other people, as well as I think Bob Damrauer had a big hand in that. Everybody reviewed it, made some edit suggestions, but I'm proud to say that the draft that I did stood up pretty well. And as well as we had input from Governor Lamm's office and Congressman Wirth's office as well. But again, they didn't change the substance of what we were recommending. It was just language.
Now, since you were Representative Wirth, Senator Wirth, no,
He was
he was a congressman at that point. Did he confer with you regularly, or?
No, I conferred very regularly with his staff, both a representative of his local Colorado office and the person assigned in his DC office. We were in very frequent contact. Yeah, so I communicated to the congressman that through them, and I knew that I was on the right wavelength as far as he was concerned.
Yeah.
That I was carrying out his direction, his goals in that.
Now, you know, one thing I'm kind of curious about, it sounds like the task force worked very well together. Now, I know later on, with a lot of citizen involvement, you know, there was so much contention and problems in meetings and so forth, but that really was not the case.
It wasn't the case in ours.
Force.
We existed for a relatively short period of time.
That's true, yeah.
We were mostly politicians and professionals. We were a small group. I think it was, 11 members and one staff member. And our job was to make recommendations, not to implement them, and not to have ongoing oversight roles, and not to criticize steps that were taken supposedly to implement what we had recommended.
Right.
We had complete cooperation, as I said. We got access to any information we wanted. We asked all the questions we could think of.
We've got about 5 minutes on this tape. So.
One thing I learned, and was because I thought I knew something about politics, but being on the inside of, like, that meeting that Congressman-elect Wirth had with the representative of IRTA, just how powerful elected officials at that level are. I mean, here he wasn't even sworn in yet, and he had the power to command that this high-level government employee, government administrator,
Turn over this
come over to his house and meet with him and comply with a request to get a top secret document, or at least a secret document, one that had not been available to the public. And pretty much to start implementing these things. I mean, it cost, I don't know how many millions of dollars to create a separate new water source for Broomfield Water.
Uh-huh.
But he did it.
Uh-huh.
And they passed legislation, and they ultimately appropriated $7 million to clean up this plant.
Yeah.
Billion
Yeah.
dollars.
Billions, yes. Yeah.
So when a congressman wants to do something, and he's good at it, and he's proactive, they can do a lot. And it's the same with the governor. They really command a whole staff, expertise, and a big employer, corporation like Rockwell wants to be on the right side of the governor, I would think.
Mm-hmm. So in a lot of ways, looking back on this, you know, it had been so secret before, especially before the '69 fire, but it sounds like the task force was just the thing that really burst, you know, made it possible to break through the secrecy.
I believe that that's the case.
Uh-huh.
And what we did was set a precedent, opened things up, and allowed what went on thereafter to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also because prior to that time there had been several efforts made to do that, to get the prior congressman to look into it, and he wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about approaches to the governor
Uh-huh.
at that time, but they just wouldn't touch it. And obviously when we got in there, we found this was a very serious problem, environmental hazard, and danger to the public that really needed to be looked at and needed to be ameliorated in some way and really gotten rid of because it didn't belong in a growing urban population area.
Yeah. Can you remember the thing or things that most shocked you? That was surprising, shocking to you?
I think I mentioned them. I mean,
Okay. The sighting.
The
sighting.
sighting,
Yeah.
you know, that they would, I believe what they did is they based it on winds at Stapleton.
Uh-huh.
And God, if they all have to do is stand out in Rocky Flats,
Right.
it's
All
one
you
of the
had to do is
windiest
visit.
places. I mean, that whole corridor we all know, when it snows, you try to avoid 93 going to
Right.
Golden because the wind is blowing snow across the road from west to east.
Yeah.
Anybody can tell you that. So that was real chutzpah to say they come from the south, but if you don't have to show that to anybody in the public,
Mm-hmm.
that's what happens. Well, it's
Yes.
$1 billion, multi-billion-dollar mistake, and that was pretty shocking to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then impressing me was two things. One, they couldn't anticipate what the next problem was going to be.
Yeah.
And two, the mentality that you had as a human being that you had to adopt or adapt to working on the plutonium, because it's not red hot, it's not glowing at you, it's not sticking you in the face with a warning, be careful. This is the most toxic substance in the world you're working on. I think the danger of being complacent working with it is great. And I wouldn't want to work there.
Yeah.
Under those conditions, because I think you get, you know, doing this, particularly a mechanical job all day long, you get, I don't want to say lazy, but you get complacent.
Yeah.
You're not.
And it sounds like you all did have some interaction with workers.
Oh yeah.
Uh-huh.
We had union people talking to us about
Right.
their problems and getting treated and not being treated and not getting medical care, people coming down with cancer after retiring and not getting treatment or compensation for that, and there were recommendations in here about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I think for the period of time we had, the resources we had, we got a good handle on what was needed, and we translated that into a report that was accepted fully by the politicians that were to whom we were making our recommendations. I mean, that's who we were working for.
Yeah.
And they went to work right away implementing.
Yeah, I think we need to Yeah. I'd like to stop this tape and change it and
Okay.
talk a little bit
I'm
more.
going to stand up.
This is a continuation of the interview with Bill Cohen for the Maria Rogers Oral History Program, and I'm Dorothy Charlo, and it's August 2nd, 2012. Okay, Bill, after that little problem, let's go back to the reaction to the task force report. Can you recall, you have said that people just accepted it.
Well, you've listed several different people, different constituencies. The media, as I said, almost universally was positive. There was one, I think it was the Denver Post editorial, that thought we were pussyfooting around.
Yeah.
We should have been
Said close it
said
down.
close it down tomorrow,
Yeah.
which we felt was impractical. The plant, they were very proactive in support. As I said, they started implementing, Rockwell started implementing those things we recommended that they could do on their own under their contract, that they didn't need special permission from ERTA to do. The community people, I think, were pleased because we had done something finally after all these years. Activists, it's really interesting. I can't tell you for sure, but the protests began on large scale in 1978, so that's
Right.
about 3 years later.
Yeah.
And I would think that one of the impetuses to that was the fact that we had this report that said you ought to do these things because there's a problem out there. It's a danger.
Yeah.
And it should be moved as soon as possible. And so the people protesting had something to rely on that was formal. It was presented and adopted by a governor and a congressman.
And that was objective.
Yeah. And so it wasn't just that they were just out there screaming against nuclear energy, although there were some people there. I have to tell you that I participated in one of those protests, the one where they almost circled the whole plant.
Yes, the 1983
Yeah,
encirclement.
I was there. My wife and I were both there. So,
Yeah.
um,
Well, that's a nice lead into a question I wanted to ask you. If you're willing to kind of reflect on, what do you think the impact of being on the task force was on your life overall?
I think I learned a lot about public policy and how it can be made and how it can be shaped and how it can be implemented, and the power of elected officials to get behind something when they want to, and how powerful they really are. I mean, this was a first-term governor, a first-term congressman, and but he was a congressman that went to Washington practically within days or weeks of being elected and organized the freshman class and took on powers that be. And so we had the right person at that level, on the federal level, to take this huge task on. David Skaggs was his chief of staff in Washington. Of course, David and I were good friends, and he became congressman, succeeded Tim Wirth, and he had a large role subsequently. So that, you know, the task force started something that responsible elected officials kept going until the objective was achieved. And it was, you know, 75 when we began, and they're still going in 2008, I think, is when the plant officially was cleaned up.
Yeah.
So that's 25, 33 years.
Yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm proud to have participated in the thing that got that started.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the other lesson is, and I've seen this throughout my own career dealing with government at a lot of different levels, you have to stick to it. things don't happen overnight. You have to, I used to teach my young interns when I was doing human rights work, that you have to follow up, stick with it, return phone calls, don't wait for the other side if they go too long, and keep at it. And let them know that you're not going away. Because a lot of what government does, or also big businesses, if you're challenging them in some way or asking them to do something they don't want to do, is wait you out. And you have to be prepared when you go into something to stick to it. And you know, that lesson I probably understood, but this was a project bigger than anything else I'd ever been involved in, and I saw that. And that lesson has been with me ever since.
Yeah, yeah.
As I've taken on governments, both foreign and domestic, local and national. So.
And as you look back at the recommendations that you drafted and the task force accepted, I think we've touched on the ways in which the recommendations were followed in one way or another. But are there any that were not followed, or?
I don't know if the GAO did a study, an investigation. There was some reluctance to look back and hold people accountable for things they had done in the past. They were more concerned about, okay, we've got a problem here, how do we fix it? That was embraced and was done. I don't want to make it sound like people waved their magic wands at it and then it overnight cleaned up, and we know it took decades.
Yeah.
But once we began that process, people kept with it. There was public scrutiny thereafter, all the way to the end, and probably still is today. So what was the point? What wasn't done?
Yeah.
But I felt people had engaged in what I would consider gross misconduct. I mean, to knowingly bury plutonium-laced machine oil and then knowingly watch it leak and cover it up, literally and figuratively, to me, it's almost, well, it's grossly negligent. In fact, it's intentional. And I felt, I was kind of young, maybe a little naive, that people ought to pay a price for that. They ought to be held accountable. And if they're working for government and they've been rewarded and kicked upstairs as a result of that, they should be, somehow there should be some accountability for doing something so egregious.
Yeah.
You know, you're dealing with the most toxic substance on Earth, of which, again, a tiny particle can kill you. And they let this stuff just drift into the atmosphere without telling anybody. And it's unconscionable. But there wasn't a consensus that we should go after that. And as I say, I don't know if the GAO looked into it, if they made any recommendations. I know Tim Wirth contacted them and asked them to do it, and there was some preliminary checking, but beyond that, I don't know. I pretty much was out of the Rocky Flats game fairly soon thereafter.
And was there any particular reasons for that? Did you have other interests?
My wife and I had just started a practice a year before. We just had a second child. And this was taking up a lot of time for which I was not being compensated, and I had to make a living. So those are the main reasons.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I think I was asked to be on the monitoring committee, but declined. So
I know that Jock Cobb, in his oral history, said that he he really began to feel uneasy. I think he said he got a little paranoid, I think that was his word, about criticism that was coming to him for his role in the task force. But you didn't have any
I have no recollections of that at all for me.
For you, that's what so you didn't feel that you paid any personal price for it?
Quite the contrary. You know, for one thing, I already had a good relationship with Tim Wirth, but my relationship was cemented, and I had gotten his help years later when he was in the Senate for other projects I was involved in, mainly the Soviet jury, for help with refuseniks. He did incredible work. Got 100 senators to write a letter to Gorbachev on behalf of the father of a local resident here, which was, I think, successful. So, and today, even though I don't see him and talk to him very often, whenever we do, we're still very good friends. Same with David Skaggs. And so those are good. I even had good relations with Dick Lamm when he was remained in the governorship. Not that I ever had any need to exploit that. But, and the thing that you really learn is the staff of these people is where all the work gets done. The prestige and the power comes from the elected official giving direction and going after things. But the real work, the people you're dealing with is staff. And I established really wonderful relationships with staff. Many of whom have gone on to do big and better things in different places where you intersect. And it's just, you know, you don't do those things with that in mind, but in retrospect, you realize that you're forming relationships that are very important because you're in the trenches together on something you believe in. And if you do a good job and you get respect mutually, it can pay off, if nothing else, just on friendly relationships.
Speaking of that, I haven't asked you what your own personal view was, or if it changed with regard to nuclear weapons and the
not nuclear weapons so much, but nuclear facilities. One of the things we did was we studied what was happening at other nuclear facilities. Not necessarily weapons plants, because I don't know that there was many others. I think there's one other in the country at the time on the East Coast. But we studied Hanford, for example, in Washington, which was many times worse in terms of pollution, nuclear pollution. And that was, I think, both a weapons facility and a nuclear plant, and the dangers of that. And I became pretty much anti-nuclear facility, just because they're wonderful things if they work. They're cost-effective in that respect. But we saw in what happened in Japan, when those things go bad, they can destroy a whole society. And it's a risk-burden thing, and at least up until recently, I felt it wasn't worth the risk. And we had an example of a plant here in Colorado that got started, and many, many millions, if not billions of dollars were spent, and it was shut down before it even became operational, because I think it was unsafe. And if there's an accident, the level of disaster is enormous. You know, it's not like a coal plant blowing up. It's probably not even like a oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico blowing up.
It's worse.
It's worse. I mean, look at Japan. And so, in my own mind, nuclear facilities I thought were very dangerous and risky, and we should find alternative ways of energy, but not nuclear. Now, France, other countries have gone nuclear, and rely on them. They seem to have good records, as far as we know. I mean, I don't know exactly how safe they are, but we've not heard of any major problems. But we hadn't heard of any in Japan either until an event occurred you couldn't anticipate. And that's the thing, you can't anticipate what's going to cause the accident.
Yeah.
The consequences are enormous.
Yeah. When you spoke of anticipating, when you were working with the Rocky Flats management, I guess, have them imagine what the kind of accident that they wouldn't expect. You said that they weren't used to thinking that way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they have a concept, and I'm probably not going to express it exactly the way it is what is a realistic, likely event. That's what they base it on. And based on that, because they have to have some criteria.
Yeah.
I mean, they can't build the Taj Mahal of safety if something smaller will get the job done realistically, and then the chance of something bigger happening that needs something more formidable to contain or prevent, it's not cost effective. So, it's cost benefit, dollars and cents factors get built into it. And as I say, Rocky Flats is not a nuclear plant. So the risk short term, if somebody hijacks an airplane, or Al Qaeda decides to bomb a weapons facility, the bang they're going to get isn't going to be quite the same as going into a nuclear plant, energy plant. On the other hand, what's the long-term effect of that? If plutonium gets dispersed very widely, gets into the soil, gets into the food chain, gets into the water system, gets into the air, with all the wind we have around here, who's exposed? How many people, how many increased deaths are we going to have from ingestion of plutonium that is minuscule?
Yeah.
For that reason, I think you can't have a nuclear plant where that can occur, a nuclear weapons plant, because I don't think you can build a system to prevent it. You can't make them so hard that an airplane is going to bounce off of it, and you don't know what the consequences are going to be. So you put it out where there's not many people. The bad news about that is you probably lose oversight.
Yeah.
Here, we got a lot of people, we got a lot of scientific people, we got a lot of knowledgeable people, we got a lot of activist people. So you can get the scrutiny once the politicians say do it, and the laws provide for it.
Yeah. And
so we can probably keep that or get rid of it in a way that cleans it up better than it would have been cleaned up if it was just left to the government to do it on its own.
Yeah.
You put it away out in the middle of nowhere, and who's going to look at it?
That makes me wonder, the citizen oversight that the task force recommended, that was actually put into law for all the nuclear weapons facilities, was it?
I believe
not?
that's true. Yeah, because it got included in where is it? Some law that created these things. And there are interagency agreements now. There's precedent for the EPA to be involved.
Right.
And they're independent agency, not with ERDR. So, I mean, I think we started something that set some precedents that got actually implemented.
Yeah.
That hopefully is being followed in a way that wherever nuclear energy or nuclear facilities of some kind are being used, they're safer. I like to believe that. And we haven't had, in this country, 3 Mile Island, I think, was one of the last things that occurred, and that turned out not to be as bad as people anticipated.
Yeah.
it was costly and had to replace the whole community.
Yeah.
But the actual danger was a lot less. But we have Chernobyl. We have Japan,
Yeah.
Tsunami. What's the next accident that's going to occur that we can't anticipate?
Right. Yeah.
And what are the consequences that we won't know?
Yeah.
That question's still in the back of my mind. And,
Mm-hmm.
no other facility that I can think of is as dangerous
Uh-huh.
as a nuclear facility.
Are there any other things that that I haven't asked or that we haven't discussed that seem important to you, either in terms of what the task force did or your own reflections?
No, yeah, I think we've covered the grounds. I'm proud of what I've done, and it's in a small way started something that got bigger, and that's fascinating to look back for me and see all that was accomplished by other people as a product of this group's work, which is really the result of Congressman Wirth and Governor Lamm being proactive in taking it on after preceding politicians had ignored it.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the real heroes as far as I'm concerned, because they had the guts to say, let's take on this thing that other people had dodged.
Yeah.
Let's take on nuclear weapons facility and make it safer, get rid of it. And it worked. And they deserve enormous credit for being politicians with some guts.
Mm-hmm.
We just, did our jobs because we could, because they gave us the scope and the authority to really dig into this. And I'm glad I had the opportunity.
Good.
And I'm pleased that somebody's still interested in it.
Yes, yeah. Well, this may be a good place to stop then. Thank you very much, Bill,
You're
for
welcome.
taking the time and the effort to do this.